Hello, everybody. Thank you, George, for inviting me. It was really a difficult decision what I was going to tell here, because you told me you do something on gender. That's all I do. So it was kind of difficult to make up my mind. So let me give it a try. No, but that's okay. So I asked George, what should I do? And he told me, like, one thing you shouldn't do. You shouldn't convince me that gender makes a difference. That's something I would have probably done a couple of years ago. But I did not go for this. But instead, I thought of some tensions that need attention, that are still around and that are important for us to think about gender and democracy and what exactly happens in what in the gender and politics discipline we call anti-gender politics and anti-gender campaigns sometimes. So one of the tensions is to think about, is gender a pragmatically chosen topic, a discursive tactics which illiberals choose because they want to derail attention from something else that might be more important and fundamental? Or is it really fundamental to the tenets of the illiberal project to think about the gender package, which has also not just discursive, but also institutional and rights consequences? Another question is, what is really new? Gender and politics literature talks a lot about how there wasn't really equality for gender equality groups ever, for women, LGBT groups. So is something new happening here? Is there a new political agenda taking place, or we just continuing on what was there before? The third question is, and that's again something that is coming up now, that attention shifts more towards LGBT and trans groups away from women's rights. Are these two distinct questions? Is really, when Trump says, let's defend women from gender ideology, is there two such things, or there is something in common here that we need to make sense when we talk about the gender agenda? Okay, here. Yeah. Okay, so I bring some results from the Kinder project, which is also a European Union project, the sister project to Zsolt's Outlook, in a way. So there we have some pretty strong premises on answering to these questions that I asked before. First of all, the premise that liberal democracy has always delivered poorly on gender equality. So it is not that there was equality and now we're returning to inequality, but we have to be aware that for not only for gender equality, but also ethnicity and for a variety of other inequalities, there was always problems with political representation, with violence, with understanding and measuring and responding to inequalities. So when we talk about what is happening here, we also have to think about transforming democracy. Another issue, another premise that we have is that the current context of anti-gender politics is embedded in de-democratization processes, and basically what happens is that it steps up opposition to gender equality, to the regular structural opposition to a political agenda, to a level of a political agenda. We think of the anti-gender politics as a project, as an anti-gender project, which turns structural resistance to equality into a political project in defense of the natural order, rooted in traditional, essentialist, biologically determined hierarchical gender binaries, and the ideal of the traditional family, which is basically at the basis of national survival. So we see the gender component of illiberal agendas present globally. It is not something that occurs here and doesn't elsewhere, but it is present quite widely, as we know from research. So it's also important to see the anti-gender project as an ideational, institutional, as having ideational, but as well institutional and policy implications. It proposes an anti-pluralistic and majoritarian conception of democracy, and which basically defines hierarchies of citizenship with different clusters of rights and duties for those who fit and those who don't fit. And in this, I think I concur with Paul's as well. So the bigger question that we have in the project is this only happening in countries which are taken over by illiberal governments, or is this happening in other countries of Europe as well? So we have a project which compares across 6 countries, 7 initially, but we kind of lost UK. So we have Belgium, Hungary, Italy, Poland, Spain, and Sweden. As you can see, is both consolidated democracies and illiberal states. We close the data in Poland still when peace is in power. And the question is what are the mechanisms that work in anti-gender politics? We basically, so the project mostly focuses on feminist responses, but we have a good part of the research which is about the anti-gender project. And we look at 3 things. We say these are fundamental, are not the only mechanisms, but are the key mechanisms that help us understand what is really happening here and how this impacts democracy or democratic erosion. First is interventions into knowledge production. Second is pathways to gender violence through anti-gender politics, and also attacks on feminist and LGBT civil society. And I won't talk about knowledge production because there's not enough time, but I talk about gender violence, and gender violence more specifically against civil society. So that's what I want to tell a little bit about. So just some premises from how in gender and politics we come to this violence agenda. So what is very important is to understand that in the gender project, violence is seen as serving both remedial and preventive functions. Basically, it both prevents and sanctions disrespect for gender hierarchy. So that is business as usual, not the anti-gender context. So what happens in the so this is present everywhere in all contexts. So what we are saying is that what happens in the context of anti-gender politics is that that this kind of preventive and remedial function of violence gains additional significance, heightened significance, and it basically operates to delegitimize, silence, and push back on enemies of the anti-gender project. So we're claiming that violence becomes a key mechanism here in this project. We claim that we need to rethink political violence in this context. We need to rethink from understanding political enemies as political competitors only, but also to include civil society and knowledge producers who are seen as key or protagonists of the gender equality or the gender ideology project, and as such as enemies of the project, and we need to include them in understanding how political violence works. We also think that is not, given the context, is not good to think of political violence as the usual political violence literature does, as incident-based, as individual instances-based, but we need to think of it more in structural terms, given the kind of hostile environment, discursive and structural environment which the anti-gender project creates. So we need to think beyond physical and sexual instances of violence and to think of threats and intimidation and hate speech, incitement, doxing, a very frequent form, online forms. So these indicate a much wider understanding of violence. So what we find in our project, the data is, and I will not have time to go into that, the data is based in 20 plus interviews in each country and several focus groups in each country with feminist and LGBT actors. And what we find is that feminist and LGBT actors are a primary targets of violence across the board. We see how both feminist and LGBT groups are included. We find it's also important to note that a distinction between women's groups and feminist groups. So not all of these are under attack, but what we see is rather, we call it in another earlier writing, a reconfiguration of civic space in which women's groups with conservative values are protected, whereas the ones who are exposed to attacks are mostly those who are asking for advantages or claiming for rights and transformation. And then another issue that is important for political violence is where is gender. So a lot of debate is going on around whether the forms of violence that happen and are used against women, are those always gender violence or not? So where exactly we can pinpoint gender? Now the literature, the most recent literature would say we have to think of both gender violence in terms of intent, in terms of form, but also, and quite importantly for us, in terms of consequences. So sometimes violence is not gendered in its form or in its intent explicitly, but the consequences that it has are deeply gendered and reproduce inequality. So basically in our data, we find the increase of violent practices and this is across the board in all of the countries, but the nature of violence that we find is very different. It's important, super important to include the role of the state here, and we rely in this on Levitsky and Wey's conceptualization of state as a weapon versus state as a shield. And we find that whereas violent tendencies are coming from anti-gender politics in all of the countries, but where the state is used as a weapon and as a shield, their violence is much more consequential. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how we talk about pathways to violence, and we have three things here. And I guess, I don't know where I'm time-wise, but I guess I won't have time to go in not a lot of time. 3 minutes? Oh God, yeah. Okay, so we talk about spotlighting enemies. So we identify different aspects of violence taking place. First is how anti-gender politics constructs and vilifies enemies. And I have a lot of nice quotes, but I won't have time for those. So how this vilification is happening, but we claim that beyond the discursive construction of the enemy, which is very powerfully done in almost all of the countries, but it's very important to see as a form of violence that is already at the margin of violence is exposing the enemy. And now you can think of listing civil society actors, doxing them, so showing their personal identities and so on. So we count this as a form of violence that is, while not physical, it is clearly threatening civil society activists. Second is the more traditional forms of sanctioning the enemy. So first they construct who's the enemy, they vilify it and spotlight it. These are the people we need to do away with. It's also a form of incitement in a way in many of the discourses. And then they sanction them. So we have evidence of online threats, basically all of the countries against these groups, also some direct physical and sexual violence against locations of civil society groups, LGBT and feminist groups alike. Also, we have protest violence, particularly from counter movements, but in as you go downwards on the list, the more you go downwards, the more the state takes up roles. So often protest violence is used, like in Poland, and rarely, but also sometimes in Hungary. But then you have raids and state auditing, which are perceived as very, very gendered. So I show you a quote on that. And also criminalization and lawfare, where they are actually criminalized, these groups. So I want to, and the third pillar is a little bit of the consequences. So I won't be going into that. I will just show you one quote on, just to get you a sense on what do I mean by gendered consequences. So on the raids and auditing, we had an interview with one of the activists who was one of the people who was personally dragged and taken away in a police car. And this is her quote. She says, "It wore me down. I had to go to therapy afterwards. I experienced this situation from the inside as if I had been raped. maybe I was the only one who experienced it as being about gender. Maybe they didn't intend it to be. So that's kind of the sense of what I wanted to give you. Now, in terms of consequences, what does it mean? And that's my last slide, George. Okay, so how is this gendered? While we don't see a lot of physical violence here. That's not what is happening, not a lot of sexual violence. But we see generally a tendency to silence, destroy, incapacitate, delegitimize feminist and LGBT groups. You look at my examples were mainly from Hungary, where you clearly see that these civil society is attacked generally, but you look at who's attacked specifically, then 1/3, sometimes half of those groups are LGBT and gender equality or feminist groups. So the proportion is really huge compared to what this would justify. These are not powerful groups. These are not about votes or anything like that. So it has three very significant gendered consequences that makes this violence different compared to other civil society. First, it has a consequence of weakening basically the responsiveness of the gender violence policy regime. Civil society, feminist and LGBT civil society, they do play a huge role in putting these making these regimes work, monitoring them. Often they provide the services and so on. And if these groups are attacked and are attacked openly, we have plenty of evidence on how victims say they're not going to go to these groups. They are afraid because these groups are now presented as enemies. So we see both a backsliding and a blocking of policies. We see an undermining of services. And also we see how basically these attacks on gender equality and on these specific groups are contributing to a broader social acceptance of gender-based violence. And as such, here the state operates as a shield in a way. So it is not really committing the violence, but it is making sure that violence is not addressed properly through these attacks against these groups. The second element that is super important, and we talked in the previous panels about this, undermining the voice and accountability towards women and LGBTQ people. So here civil society plays a complementary role to formal political representation. So for these groups which do not have proper representation, civil society is the representation, is the actor which is claiming accountability and voice. So undermining them and destroying them and attacking them is clearly blocking these processes of accountability. And finally, when violence against these groups happen is not about just civil society space being curtailed or freedom of association being undermined, but these are very clear message crimes that are sending a message to these groups who are represented by these civil society actors, a message about hierarchies on who's in and who's out and whose citizenship counts properly and whose doesn't. So that's only conclusions. Okay, thank you.